As the USS Enterprise headed southwest to support the Guadalcanal Campaign, she once more found herself host to a composite air group. VB-6 and VF-6 remained from her original squadrons, but the scouting unit was currently VS-5, lately from Yorktown, while Saratoga's VT-3 with their brand new Avengers made up the torpedo complement. VT-3's presence was understandable given the absolute decimation of all three Yorktown-classes VT units at Midway, but the presence of VS-5 was there thanks to Enterprise essentially merging her own Air Group 6 Dauntless pilots from VB-6 and VS-6 into VB-6, along with similarly merging the pilots of VB-5 and VS-5 into a single squadron, thus allowing the ship to stay in the fight without any prolonged downtime to rebuild her air wing. The opening moves of the invasion of Guadalcanal, aka Operation Watchtower, saw Enterprise primarily contribute to the overwatch over the fleet, as most of VF-6 could be seen orbiting the invasion transports as guard against potential attack from Japanese strike craft. Although a 9 Dauntless formation went off to Tulagi with Wasp's air group to attack the Japanese seaplane base there, most of the direct support operations for the landings would be handled by Saratoga's air wing, although over the course of the next couple of days, a few more of Enterprise's strike aircraft would launch in aid of that as well. Now, although the nearest major concentration of Japanese aircraft was at Rabaul, over 600 miles from the invasion convoy, the need for a combat air patrol was rather quickly demonstrated as G4M Bettys and A6M Zeros, which were more than capable of that extended round trip, were soon detected inbound. This air battle had mixed results. The Zeros had become somewhat separated from the bombers during the long flight in, and this allowed the Wildcats to get free first passes at the Bettys. But at the same time, it led to some US pilots getting a little too fixated on the bombers, which meant that when the Zeros finally showed up, a number of US aircraft were jumped unexpectedly. Now, although the F4F did have some advantages over the A6M in various fields of aerial combat, a fight that began with both aircraft at roughly the same altitude but the Zeros having come in from a slightly higher one was not a scenario that favoured the Wildcat. VF-6 would lose 6 aircraft and 3 pilots in exchange for an array of claims against Bettys, Zeros, and a few Vals that showed up, apparently on their own completely separate attack mission. One pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Firebau, had started the war aboard Lexington and was about as experienced as they came. He managed to claim 2 Zeros before he was in turn set on fire and shot down. Mindful of not then wanting to be shot up while floating down to the surface on his parachute, as Japanese pilots were known to do this, he improvised what we would now call a halo or high-altitude low-opening jump, pulling his ripcord barely a few hundred feet above sea level, having a few swings back and forth, and then landing in said sea, and then deciding, well, there's nothing much for it but to start swimming to the nearest island. A few stray Zeros, which included the legendary multiple ace Saburo Sakai, fell in with some of the Dauntlesses that were bombing Tulagi, after having shot up and shot down a number of other US aircraft. This resulted in a brisk exchange of gunfire that damaged both the Dauntless and the Sakai's Zero. Sakai then faced a nearly impossible flight. He had to head just over 600 miles back home with a face and body full of glass and bullet fragments. Having survived that, and a subsequent surgery that was done without anaesthetic, Sakai would actually return to the front line and survive the war. He only died in the year 2000 at the age of 84. But back over Guadalcanal, losses in the air were, when totalled up, almost even in terms of total overall numbers, but the veteran Japanese Zero pilots had claimed a fair few Wildcats in exchange for almost no losses of their own, the majority of Japanese losses being in Vals and Bettys, illustrating both the remaining lethality of the Japanese Navy's Air Corps and the need for still further improved US fighters. Enterprise's own officers, in consultation with the pilots, observed that the F4F4, considering equality of pilots, is no match for the Japanese Zero fighter in a dogfight plane for plane due to the superiority of the Zero in climb, speed, maneuverability, and endurance. However, in its ruggedness, ability to take it, and the firepower, the F4F4 is superior to Zeros. These factors of superiority, combined with an apparent superiority of our pilots in deflection shooting, give the F4F4 a reasonable chance of attaining a successful outcome in an engagement in which there are several fighters involved on both sides. The principal weaknesses of the Zero are 1. An inability to absorb hits, and 2. Ineffective firepower. The modification of the design of either airplane toward that of the other would probably result in a fighter superior to both the F4F4 and the Zero. However, with only one US destroyer damaged by the attacks, the aerial combat had ultimately fulfilled its purpose. Aircraft, after all, were much easier to replace than ships, especially at this critical juncture in the operations. The Enterprise's log for the 2 days of the initial landings and the aerial combats that resulted listed the following points. A. Launchings and landings. A total of 372 takeoffs and 366 landings were made without a single personnel or material casualty. During the 7th of August, 236 takeoffs and 229 landings were successfully completed for a new record in a single day's operation in a combat area. 25 takeoffs and 10 landings were made at night. 12 launching and landing operations were conducted on the 7th, and 10 launching and 9 landing operations on the 8th. B. Pilot time. 91 pilots flew a total of 1,001 hours. Average pilot time by types: VF 12.5 hours, VSB 11.5 hours, VTB 9 hours. One VF pilot flew a total of 18.7 hours during the 2 days. Another VF pilot 11 hours just on the 7th. Ammunition expended. 90,500 pounds of bombs were dropped. 1 torpedo was launched. 41,350 rounds of 50 caliber and 10,550 rounds of 30 caliber were expended. D. Gasoline expended. Our operations on the 7th required the expenditure of 30,482 gallons of gasoline. 22,007 gallons were required on the 8th, for a total of 52,489 gallons. E. Searches. On scouting missions, our VTB searched an area of about 125,500 square miles. Tunibuli Bay, Maringe Lagoon, Relata Bay, and Gizo Anchorage were scouted and photographed by our VTB. F. Special missions. On the 7th, one VSB obtained vertical and oblique photographs of vital areas of Guadalcanal and a small island west of Florida Island. The photographs and interpretation reports were delivered to the 1st Marine Division headquarters at Lunga Point by 2 VSBs using special message drop containers. G. Personnel and material losses. 6 VF pilots and planes were lost. At least 4 of these were lost or missing after water landings. 2 of 3 VF and 1 VSB damaged in combat have been repaired and are operating. The 3rd fighter will be operating within the next 48 hours. H. Damage inflicted. On the 7th, our VF shot down 3 Japanese twin-engine bombers, 1 Zero and 5 dive bombers. 2 Zeros and 5 bombers were listed as possibles, and 1 Zero was knocked down by a VSB free gunner. On the 8th, our VF shot down 4 twin-engine bombers and 1 dive bomber. Total tally, 15 planes shot down and 7 possibles. So it gives you some idea of the logistical expenditure and activities just in those 2 days. Of course, what you might have gained from that is that on the 8th, more Japanese aircraft did indeed appear. This time the US pilots managed to get the drop in on the G4Ms, as once again they were separated from their escort, but the Zeros on the 8th took longer to get back to their charges, and so the score on that day more generally favoured the US Navy. But between air combat and general attrition, the roughly 100 Wildcats present aboard Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp had been reduced by almost 24 airframes over the course of 48 hours. And even when pilots survived, like Firebauer, they weren't necessarily immediately available. Firebauer himself was chilling out on Santa Isabel Island. With no replacement airframes to hand and the fleet running low on fuel, Admiral Fletcher was granted permission to withdraw to refuel by Admiral Gormley. There was no sense in risking the handful of fleet oilers available by bringing them forward and thus into strike range of the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft. That night, of course, would see the first Battle of Savo Island, and the savaging of the Allied cruiser force in the process. While this was a disaster, there was precious little the carriers could have done about it, as they were not trained or equipped for night flying at this stage. The best they could have done was maybe try to catch the Japanese ships as they withdrew, but by then the damage was already done. On a happier note for Enterprise, a coast watcher found Fireball on Santa Isabel and radioed his acquisition back to the fleet. With the initial struggle to get a foothold on Guadalcanal over, the carriers refueled, and some began to dispatch aircraft to Henderson Field. But partway through the second week of operations, a Catalina on patrol spotted a Japanese resupply convoy on its way south. But this time it was supported by multiple enemy carriers. It was going to be time to face the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet once again. Now, this isn't to say that up to this point the Japanese Navy's attacks had been limited only to aircraft and some night actions with cruisers. The US carriers had in fact been constantly harassed by a large number of Japanese submarines, but a combination of skill and luck had kept the flat tops safe for now, with either pilots spotting the submarines and driving them off with dive bomb attacks, or in one case the heavy cruiser USS Portland spotted an incoming spread of torpedoes heading for the Enterprise, giving enough warning for Enterprise to take the appropriate evasive action. On the dawn of the 24th of August 1942, though, Wasp was away refueling, which left Enterprise in Saratoga to face off with Shikaku and Zuikaku, who had support from the smaller Rugio. Enterprise was ordered to fly off nearly 24 aircraft to hunt for the smaller Japanese carrier, a mixture of Dauntlesses and Avengers. Rugio had been spotted that morning by patrolling aircraft from land bases, but they hadn't managed to maintain contact. 3 separate pairs of Enterprise aircraft on scouting duty would actually find Rugio. First, a pair of Dauntlesses, then a Dauntless and an Avenger, and then 2 Avengers. This latter pair chanced their arm by dropping some bombs, which prompted the second pair to try their luck as well. Although this resulted in no damage, the consistent position reports they sent out were enough for Saratoga to dispatch a concerted airstrike that would send the smaller carrier to the bottom. One of Enterprise's scouting Avengers was shot down by Japanese fighters in exchange. Other aircraft from the scouting wave that had been sent out from Enterprise found and attacked a Japanese surface ship formation, including the cruiser Maya, and the Japanese carrier formation, skirting around its escorts to drop bombs on Shikaku herself. These managed to get a number of near misses, but unfortunately no direct hits. But at the same time, Japanese scouts had managed to break through the cordon of US aircraft, and a Japanese strike was now inbound. A good chunk of Enterprise's remaining strike aircraft were already airborne. Many had been launched to go after exactly the same contact, Rugio, as Saratoga's aircraft, but obviously Saratoga's aircraft had inevitably beaten them to the punch. But still others had been sent airborne at the suggestion of the ship's air operations officer, who'd pointed out that every aircraft not aboard Enterprise was one less potential source of burning aviation fuel, fragments, and ordnance should the ship be hit. The last strike aircraft to get airborne was witness to aircraft bearing the Rising Sun roundel diving into attack in their rearview mirrors. Now, in theory, the US carriers were fairly well protected. An unprecedented 54 Wildcats were up in the air to greet the Japanese. Unfortunately, though, while there was fighter direction available down on Enterprise, with a number of officers having been trained by both the US Navy and the Royal Navy, which at this point in time was passing on its hard-won experience in that field, the lessons from both navies hadn't quite been fully implemented at this point, and a combination of a limited number of radio channels and some very overexcited fighter pilots with almost no impulse control meant that the fighter direction officers could barely get a word in edgeways amongst all the chatter, and when they did, it was often lost in said chatter, as the pilots were using the radio more like an open chat server. As a result, the first thing a good number of the Wildcats saw of the engagement was when a bunch of Vals came diving past them. Still, on the principle of better late than never, the F-4Fs duly turned and dove after the Japanese strike package. They joined a falling column of Vals and Zeros, and soon the whole lot were bracketed by much exploding ordnance as Enterprise's full anti-aircraft battery, now composed of 5-inch, 1.1-inch and 20mm Oerlikon guns, plus the guns of her escorts, all opened up. Soon burning aircraft and bits of debris joined the plummeting mass, but amongst it all were also a large number of bombs, as the Wildcats had, generally speaking, arrived too late to prevent the Japanese pilots from releasing their ordnance. Despite dodging as hard as she could, Enterprise took her first hit near the aft elevator, a 500-pound bomb that headed down 5 decks before exploding, shaking the ship from stem to stern as the explosion vented back up the way the bomb had come. The crew had to juggle manning the anti-aircraft guns with fighting fires. More aircraft were on their way down, which meant you had to shoot back, but just ignoring live ammunition lockers that were on fire right next to you was really just doing the Japanese pilot's job for them. And then another bomb landed. This one was armed with an instant fuse, landing less than a plane's length from the first impact point. 73 men were killed instantly by the 2 explosions, with many more wounded and the ship now trailing a long column of smoke. The men on the aft of the island looked up and saw yet another bomb coming in, seemingly suspended immobile in midair, and thus not moving, except for the fact it was getting rather rapidly larger. Recognizing the signs of a collision course when they saw it, everybody made haste through a hatch, the last man getting inside just before the bomb slammed into the flight deck just ahead of the midships elevator. It seems that either the bomb's detonator malfunctioned, or possibly the bomb broke up on impact, as the explosion, while powerful, was not anywhere near as bad as it should have been, indeed as bad as the other 2 had been. This, as it turned out, was incredibly lucky, as fragments of the bomb were found to have embedded themselves in the armor plating surrounding the torpedo magazine in the aftermath. Who knows what could have happened if those lumps of metal had had a little bit more energy behind them, considering that plating was only 1.5 inches thick. Damage control crews raced about, fighting fires, closing down air vents so that smoke didn't run through the ship, trying to rescue trapped crewmates, and of course conscious at all times that another bomb might well be on its way. Enterprise, as we mentioned, had been taking severe evasive action, but this particular edition of Fast and the Furious Solomon's Drift was brought to an end as bomb damage had jammed the rudder at 22 degrees to port. The carrier was then left to blare warnings from its horn at nearby ships as she span around out of control in circles. Steering via the propellers was useless against such a degree of rudder being locked in, and slowing the ship down was an option they could only undertake briefly to avoid an otherwise certain collision with a destroyer. Just coasting to a stop would have solved the circling issue, but it also would have been painting a huge target on the ship. It was vital that the auxiliary steering unit be initiated, but the blistering heat surrounding the steering compartment had overwhelmed the men inside. A thermometer gauge was later found to have maxed out at 180 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't as hot as it actually got in there. The needle had bent and stuck to the limiter bar, so it had gotten even hotter. That's just as high as the gauge actually went. And into this hell, numerous damage control men headed to try and reach the compartment, only to be subsequently overwhelmed one by the heat before they got there, and having to be hauled back into cooler environments by their crewmates, who rather wisely had tied ropes to them ahead of time just in case. Eventually, 2 plank owners, men who'd been with the ship since its commissioning, Chief Smith and Cecil Robinson, decided they were going to make the attempt. Smith tried 2 different routes, but on both he was overwhelmed by the heat and had to be pulled out both times and then revived. Amazingly, he got up for a 3rd try, and this time they managed to move enough debris from a 3rd route, which improved the airflow just enough that they managed to make it to the steering area, cranking up the auxiliary unit and then making it back out just in time, as both would collapse into the arms of their waiting crewmates. But Smith, almost unbelievably, then rallied from the extreme heat stroke for a 3rd time, staggered his way up to the bridge, reported his success, and then headed back down to supervise the slowly cooling compartment, although he did collapse from heat exhaustion on the way and had to be revived a 4th time. He then planted himself in the steering compartment and refused to leave until he was sure the ship was safe. Understandably, he would earn a Navy Cross for these efforts, and a commission. While all this was going on, a great mystery attended those who were now greasing up the unfrozen rudder shafts. The 7 men who'd been in the steering compartment when the bombs had hit had been nowhere to be found. Indeed, Smith and Robinson, the first men in the compartment, reported finding the place completely empty. In the aftermath, 1 of the men turned up dead of heat stroke, but the other 6 were found alive, and only mildly cooked, on the hangar deck of all places, just as confused as to what had happened as everybody else. Eventually, it emerged that one of the crew, a rather large Midwestern farm boy by the name of Ernest Visto, had become concerned when he realised where the damage was, as he knew the men in the steering compartment, and had donned a gas mask to go check on his friends via one of the emergency escape ladders. Finding them incapacitated, he then proceeded to heave them up one at a time like sacks of corn and just hauled them out to safety, seemingly completely immune to the oven-like thermometer-breaking conditions, before passing out just as he got the last man safely away, then coming around himself and heading back to his battle station as if nothing had happened. Of course, since he didn't know the steering gear was out of action, he hadn't done anything in that regard, which resulted in an empty compartment for the rather confused Smith to find. When eventually questioned, he was initially evasive since, after all, he had left his battle station in the middle of an action. The recounting of his post-battle interview bears pretty much just reading out in full. So, Visto disclaimed having been in the steering room, but his manner was so evasive that Commander Yost persisted. "You left your battle station to help, Visto. Where did you go?" Then, with some reluctance, Visto admitted, "I'm sorry, sir. I left my station when I thought I could help out. I couldn't make one of those fancy breathing masks fit me, so I went in with my gas mask, even though I was breaking orders. I worked my way down, and I guess I got them out. I'm sorry, sir, that I left my battle station." Yost demanded, "Do you mean to tell me, Visto, that you got these 7 men out alone?" Visto nodded. "And you fought your way through all that wreckage while others couldn't, and that in spite of the terrific heat, you lifted those 7 men out alone?" "Well, I did have to lug and shove them around, more or less." "And did you become unconscious?" Visto looked ashamed. "After I got the last man out, I went hazy in my head and passed out, and that's another thing I guess I shouldn't have done." Still struggling to comprehend where on earth this man's endurance had come from, Enterprise's officers decided that instead of punishing him, they were going to nominate him for the Navy Cross as well. You'll be glad to know he received that in due course. Up in the air, 11 of the ship's Dauntlesses had to divert to Guadalcanal as darkness rapidly overtook the battlefield. They would end up flying with the Cactus Air Force for the next month or so. Other aircraft made their way over to Saratoga, and a few even actually managed to get back aboard Enterprise once the worst of the fires were put out, having to complicate their landing procedures by coming in right on the port edge of the flight deck as they needed to avoid the area where the deep penetrating bomb had bulged it up on the starboard side. With the battle largely over, Enterprise's crew continued damage control. There were 240 tons of water that had to be pumped out, which was a mixture of seawater from various leaks and holes, along with all the water from the firefighting efforts that had sluiced down through the ship. A bomb hole just above the waterline needed to be shored up to prevent further water ingress, and a final tally of the dead had to be made. 5 more men had succumbed to wounds or heat, in addition to those who'd been killed outright by the bomb blasts, for a total of 78 dead and another 90 wounded. 10 aircraft had been lost, although most of the pilots and crew had been recovered, as the vast majority of airframe losses had either been from aircraft that had ditched near various US ships, or had managed to land on a carrier but then been judged too badly damaged to be worth repairing. The Afteraction report offered some rather interesting conclusions and recommendations, including, but not limited to, 3 categories which I'll read out. Communications. Once again, as in the past in the Coral Sea and at Midway, communications have been shown to be a weak point to the danger. Due to the lack of proper training, reporting pilots in all commands continue to transmit vague, ambiguous, and confusing contact reports, frequently omitting several of the vital components of a complete contact report and often failing to continue to report. A lack of discipline in the matter of radio transmission by aircraft in contact with the enemy has been the subject of detailed comment by the Fighter Director Officer in Enclosure F. Radio silence should not be imposed on such occasions because responsible leaders of flights can and should furnish valuable information to the Fighter Director Officers and to the Task Force Commanders, but there should be little necessity for interplane transmission except by squadron and division commanders, and this should be limited to the minimum necessary for the prosecution of the attack. The intolerable confusion caused by unrestrained transmission is difficult to eliminate. For war conditions reduce to 0 the experience, prior to action, of the majority of pilots in the use of voice radio. There can and must be improvement, however. An even more serious fault in existing communications was the delay in receipt of contact reports, which originated with our shore and tender-based aircraft. Sometimes as many as 6 to 12 hours elapsed from the time of contact to the time of receipt of the report of contact by the interested commander, even though such reports were in urgent priority categories. In the matter of finding, accurately reporting the position of, and tracking units and groups of enemy forces, we suffer by comparison with the enemy. With the development of radar by the Japanese for fighter direction, the present effectiveness of our seaplane scouts and patrols will be reduced. In the future, these vital operations will require fast, long-range airplanes with a heavy defensive armament. In other words, the Navy must have large numbers of land-plane bomber-type aircraft on which it has first call and complete control. Air Group personnel. Shortly before sailing on the current mission, the Enterprise Air Group was formed of hastily collected remnants of squadrons from 3 previously existing air groups. The majority of the pilots were very inexperienced, and although an intensive last-minute training schedule was conducted, the time available was definitely insufficient for adequate progress. Except for the fighting squadron, the state of gunnery and bombing proficiency of the group when it embarked was extremely low, and the group had not had opportunity to become a cohesive striking unit. Although every opportunity to train was utilized during passage to the Coral Sea, with much obvious improvement, and although there was much more training opportunity than could normally be expected after a task force departs on a specific mission, the lack of gunnery training and indoctrination of the group as a whole was keenly felt. This condition obtained to a lesser degree in the fighting squadron, which had had more previous training than the others and which, in the preliminary and final engagements, accounted for the destruction of a large number of enemy aircraft while sustaining relatively small losses itself. These conditions are pointed out in no spirit of criticism, for it is realized that the need for best possible preparedness and training of carrier air groups is recognized by all concerned. The demands of the strategic situation, coupled with an unavoidably inadequate initial backlog of trained carrier squadrons, have almost literally left us no choice in the matter to date. Nevertheless, it cannot be too often reiterated nor too strongly stressed that conditions that have had to be accepted to date are really serious, and we must take care not to underestimate the vital urgency of improvement. The squadron should not be considered a separate entity which may be shifted from one group to another at will. The group should be the unit, and no group should normally be sent aboard a carrier for active combat with the enemy until it has had at least 4 months of intensive gunnery, tactical, and scouting training as a unit, and in an area in which training is not unduly interfered with by the necessity of security and defensive measures. This can be termed old stuff. It is very true, however. The sooner it is possible to do it, the sooner we shall become not merely more effective, but enormously more effective in both offence and defence. Meanwhile, the employment of a carrier in combat areas with less than the best possible air group can be justified only by the most urgent strategic demands, and the possible price of merely average effectiveness, or even less, must not only be accepted, but recognised. Anti-aircraft protection. The fire control radar on Enterprise was ineffective. It is not known whether or not other vessels in the task force obtained acceptable results from their corresponding equipment, but the fact remains that no 5-inch fire from any vessel in the task force was commenced while the enemy aircraft were at high altitudes at which these guns were the only ones having the necessary range. The 5-inch fire was commenced only after that of Enterprise's small caliber weapons, and after the first attacking planes were already in their dives. Unquestionably, the personal element looms large in the operation of the fire control radar, and improved results can be obtained with additional training. It has been reported, however, that the fire control radar equipment is of extreme sensitiveness and requires reasonably accurate predetermination by other means of range, elevation, and azimuth in order to pick up the target. If this is to a degree which is not likely to be possible of attainment in the tense, hurried atmosphere prior to and during the battle, the existing equipment should be replaced by other equipment that can fulfill its purpose under all conditions. Supporting vessels cannot wholly protect an aircraft carrier from determined dive-bombing attack from high altitude, and their fire is apt to be less effective than that of the carrier herself due to deflection problems. The 20mm guns, while probably the most effective anti-aircraft guns against dive bombers, have not sufficient range to prevent determined attacking planes from reaching an effective release point. Well-trained 20mm batteries can, however, prevent low releases and can take a heavy toll in attacking dive bombers which pull out at low altitudes. The 20mm gun is considered to be a generally excellent and effective weapon, and it is recommended that these guns be installed in every available space on all ships. Well-directed fighting planes in large numbers still remain the most effective defense against attack by enemy aircraft. The battered ship now headed for Pearl Harbor, swapping places with Hornet to leave 3 carriers on the front line. That, however, was not a circumstance that would last long. Less than a week after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Saratoga was torpedoed and sent back to the yards for repairs. And 2 weeks after that, I-19 fired her famous salvo, damaging North Carolina, fatally wounding the destroyer O'Brien, and ripping open the hull of the carrier USS Wasp and sending her to the bottom in flames. Enterprise was therefore desperately needed back on the front lines, but as much as the ship itself needed repairs, the men were also in need of replenishment. A new captain, Osborne Hardison, was in command. Captain Davis had been promoted to Rear Admiral and moved to command the new Essex-class carriers that were fitting out and working up in the Atlantic. He would later go on to become the Chief of Staff to Admiral Spruance in the last year of the war. The ad hoc pulled-together air group that had once been Carrier Air Group 6 was also landed and dispersed to various duties. Some pilots went to new units, some pilots simply went to rest, others went to instructor positions back home. In its place came Carrier Air Group 10, made up of 36 F4F Wildcats of VF-10, another 36 SBD-3 Dauntlesses split evenly between VB-10 and VS-10, and 15 TBF Avengers in VT-10. Although a new air group, it was by no means made up of all green pilots. The squadron leaders and the Carrier Air Group commander were all very experienced, and a number of them took it upon themselves to recruit various veteran pilots into their units. VF-10 attracted a number of Dauntless pilots who were eager to switch over to fighters. VT-10 was led at this point by John Collett, a man who was so obsessed with proving that night carrier operations could be a thing in the US Navy that when he spotted an experimental radar-equipped Avenger sitting on an airfield in Hawaii, he essentially stole it and brought it aboard Enterprise. By mid-October, the air group was being rushed through final carrier qualifications. A total of 95 aircraft, including spares, were packed aboard, and the ship set out once again. Her old sparring mates, the Shikakus, were up to shenanigans near Guadalcanal, and it was time to square off against them once more.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.